was this woman so convinced that she was not going to hang for her crimes that she wore a wedding dress, hoping somebody would propose to her and save her from her fate? Wow, that's a lot. Let's listen to the true story of Lavinia Fisher. Well, hello my silky friends. It's been about a year since I started my channel, and I am going to go back to old school. I've got my Aunt Jenny hat on today. If you haven't seen that story, my goodness, go back and look at it. And then I've also got my tea. And we're spilling it today in Charleston, South Carolina. Okay, so let me start by telling you there are so many tales of this woman and her husband and their deeds. It's very similar to the case of the Bloody Benders, and it often makes me wonder if maybe the Benders got the idea from the Fishers. I have decided, because there's so many different versions of this story, I'm going to read to you something that was written and published in a newspaper by an older family member. I love the way it's written. It was written in about the 1890s, which was quite a bit away from the time of the crime, so memories might not be 100%. But as we go through this, I'm going to also give you kind of an update on things that we've learned since then. But let me get my glasses. A young murderous couple. At the beginning of the year, 1819, the host and hostess of the 6 Mile House were John and Lavinia Fisher. They were young married people, not yet in their 30s, of pleasing appearance, ready address, and knew how to give the weary traveler such a welcome as made him feel the inn was more like a home than a public resort. Added to this, there was excellent fare for both man and beast. That means she cooked well. Now, let me back up for just a second and tell you a little bit about Charleston at the time. Lavinia Fisher was born in 1793. As far as we know, records, as you know, were not great. And for her, there may have been an even bigger reason why, but I will tell you that at the end of this. Now, Charleston was only second in the whole country as far as population to New York City. It was a bustling port. You had a lot of people. You had a lot of, slave owners. And you had a lot of African American population as well in this area. Now, you had the high echelon of people, very small percentage, who were, walking in high cotton, as they'd say, very wealthy. And then the rest of the people, they were trying to get by. Well, Charleston, being a port, was a big place where people would go to buy and trade their goods. So let's say the farmers or manufacturers, whatever goods that they were producing, they would go and sell them in Charleston. And, it was miles back to where they lived, out in the rural areas, most of them. And so they often would be traveling with large amounts of money and or expensive goods. Now, this is a problem if you're traveling by yourself. So understand that in this environment, you had a lot of what they call highwaymen. I mean, they would just stop your wagon in the middle of the road, take everything you've got, and you'd be lucky to come out with your life. So other people, in a way to make money, if they had the larger houses, extra rooms, they would have a place where someone could stop and rest, maybe get a meal, maybe spend the night in their travels. So you have a lot of these kind of, houses, what we would call a hotel or rest stop or something like that along the way. Well, there were 2 houses in this area that were kind of nefarious. One was called the 5 Mile House, and the other one was the 6 Mile House, named because, of course, they were 5 and 6 miles from Charleston. So now that you know a little bit about the background, let's go back to this article. Some months prior to this, that is in the fall and winter of 1818, there had been numerous robberies along 2 stage lines. In 1 or 2 instances, life had been taken. Oh my. The Charleston papers of those dates were full of these robberies and murders. Many private travelers were also attacked. In some instances, they vanished away as though the earth had swallowed them. The governor and the United States government both offered rewards, but it was all in vain. There seemed to be a band of robbers working with one another. Finally, they were located in the neighborhood of the 5 Mile and 6 Mile houses, and then traced to the houses themselves. Now, let me stop here for just a second. This gentleman we're going to talk about, his name was John Peebles. Now, prior to this, you know how it is. The people, they're sitting around the tavern, they're drinking, they're carrying on, and they're talking about all these robberies and people disappearing, and they're a mite concerned, and they think they've got it narrowed down to people, highwaymen that are between the 5 and 6 Mile house, and some people who have stayed in those houses just didn't come home. So they decide to do what any sensible person would. They started a mob, and they decided they were going to go take matters into their own hands, because clearly even the government couldn't handle this problem. So they go to the 5 Mile house, and they give them 15 minutes to get out. Well, the 5 Mile house people, they decided they weren't giving up their business, and they weren't taking orders from this mob. So the mob burned the house down. Now, the owners of the house, they did get out, and, everybody scurried. So when the 6 Mile house could smell the fire and could probably see the smoke in the air, they realized, the jig is up. So they were prepared when the posse or mob, whatever, came to their house, and they gave them 15 minutes to get all their stuff out. Now, my goodness, my nose is itching. Anyway, it is said that they complied. They didn't want any trouble. They didn't want their house burned down. And the mob took over the house, and they did set the house on fire. Well, they all left, except they left for one guy as a guard or watchman, David Ross, to kind of look over the property. Well, as soon as the mob left, the Fishers and all the residents and whatever of the 6 Mile house, they all come back. And they are mad as hornets at David Ross. So, earlier when he had met the people from this house, they, were very compliant. So when David Ross sees Lavinia, who is said to be a very, very beautiful woman, he's relieved. And so he thinks that he's going to get some sympathy. She's going to keep everything, quiet and calm. Oh, but no. It is said that Lavinia takes her hands, puts them around, right here, his neck. And she begins to squeeze like she is violent. And she even takes a pane of glass and breaks it over his head. At which point they start beating up on him, but he manages to get away and run into town. So, now you've got David Ross, who's just run into town. And then shortly thereafter, you have another guy named Mr. Peebles. Let me tell you this. As a side note, there was a report of another woman named Jane who was a large, stout woman. And this is who David Ross said was Lavinia, but he described her as being large and stout. Well, Lavinia was small, petite, and beautiful. So it doesn't sound like it's the same person, which would probably be why Lavinia later on down the road says she is innocent of these crimes. But let's go on with this report. Okay, so when John Peebles comes up to the sheriff, it says the sheriff was astounded, then incredulous. John and Lavinia Fisher, he couldn't believe it. But the young man told a straightforward story. He had put up at the 6 Mile house. He had been awakened in the night by the murmur of voices. He had looked through a crack in the adjoining room. And he had seen the Fishers emptying his wallet and counting his coins. He had heard the woman say that he must be unalived, that it would not do to let him escape. But the man pled for him. Finally, she said she believed he had other valuables, and that his horse, too, was a fine one. And really, she must attend to him at breakfast. Well, he knew what that meant. Poison in his cup. That was an easier way to get rid of him than by pistol or knife. And at daylight he managed to escape, mounting his horse. He sped toward the city. The name of this young man was John Peebles, and the supposition is that he was a traveler from Georgia. Let me say this, there are a lot of accounts where John Peebles says it was in the evening when he arrived at the house, and that Lavinia offered him, pretty much insisted on giving him a cup of tea. As it happened, John Peebles hated tea, and she made such a fuss about him drinking it that he didn't want to be rude. So when she got distracted, he leaned over and poured that tea into a plant that was nearby. And she just kept sitting there at the table expecting something to happen. So in the meantime, she just keeps asking him questions and questions and questions and goes on and on and on about it. Well, finally she gives up. She doesn't know why this man is just sitting there, and of course he's perplexed because her husband is, not the one talking to him. This was highly unusual for this time period. Finally, she decides that, yes, a room has become available if you want to spend the night. So he goes to his room and he really starts thinking about this whole situation, and he thinks there is a little bit something sus about Lavinia and the way she was acting and the way John Fisher was acting. So he decides to stay up in a chair, awake, not get in the bed. Well, as time passed, he did grow sleepy, and he fell asleep, only to be startled by this sound, this boom, a crash that wakes him up. Then, lo and behold, he looks over, and his bed has completely gone into the floor, and he sees that it's a trap door. So obviously, he realizes this is a trap, and he hightails it out the window and goes to town. Now, that is one version of the story. The sheriff acted quickly. He gathered an armed squad and placed his deputy, Colonel Cleary, at the head. His arrests were made on Saturday, February 13th, 1819. By this time, a crowd had gathered. That night, the house and the outbuildings were burned to the ground, doubtless the work of the robbers. So let's go on. The Fishers and those arrested with them were carried to Charleston and lodged in jail. Indeed, the woman especially was considerably upset on this occasion. Imagine that. The Fishers and others were brought to trial on March 23, 1819, before Judge Bay. The evidence against them, particularly against the Fishers, was very damaging. Shortly after the Fishers were sent back to jail, intense excitement was aroused by the discovery in the vicinity of the 6 Mile House of a suspicious-looking grave. The sheriff was notified. He sent Mr. Henry Stevens, the coroner, to investigate. Mr. Stevens opened the grave and found 2 bodies side by side. There was no clue whatsoever to their identity. They were doubtless private travelers from a long distance who had met the tragic fate at the 6 Mile House. Now, let me stop here and say there are other reports that say the 2 people found, one was a young slave woman, which would have been honestly a normal, and then one was of a man who had been shot, and they did not know his identity. So that was really the only suspicious one, and they thought they knew it was one of the recent travelers that had come up missing. After the house was burned, the ruins were not disturbed, but one day, some months afterward, an individual with a turn of mind rather more investigating almost lost his life by coming within a fraction of falling down into a gaping mouth of an excavation, and the entire opening of a cellar was exposed to view. They brought a ladder, and one of them made a descent and discovered bones, plenty of them, and human bones at that. This was surely enough to ruin the Fishers. Okay, now let me remind you, there are a few reports like this. However, there may have been another motivation for this. In most of the reports, they do not say, that there were bones under the house. However, I wasn't there, and I don't know for sure. You know how people talk. On Monday, September 13th, pending the hearing of the petition of the new trial, John Fisher and John Roberts escaped from the jail. I'm going to make this short. Basically, they had kind of whittled a hole out of the side of the jail. They had gotten some bed sheets, made a rope, and they were going down. Well, what happened is Roberts went first and John Fisher went second. When he went down, the rope broke. Lavinia was in the cell waiting. She wanted everybody else to go first, doubtless to help her down, catch her maybe in case she fell. Now, when the rope broke, Lavinia was not going out that cell. So Fisher and Roberts took off. But John wasn't about to leave his beautiful wife. A description of Fisher was given as follows. About 6 feet high, slim-made, knock-kneed, fair complexion, dark hair, and dark eyes, and about 30 years of age. How would you like to be described as knock-kneed? Lord have mercy. On the night of the 14th of September at about 11 o'clock, as Mr. Bull, a grocer on South Bay, was preparing to close his store for the night, he had a call from 2 men who expressed the desire to purchase a small supply of eatables. So to make a long story short, Fisher and Roberts, they had gone to like a little island. They had gathered some things, robbed some people. They had gold watches and other things in their possession, but John Fisher could not leave the lovely Lavinia in jail, and he insisted that they go back for her. And this, in the meantime, is where they were caught. Mr. Bull follows them, sees them hiding under a boat, and calls the law, and they are quickly incarcerated again. But no one took it harder than poor Mrs. Fisher. Okay, so then on January 18th, 1820, the Fishers were again brought to trial. The charges were so grave and the evidence so overwhelming that both were sentenced to be, unalived with a rope. You know what I'm talking about. They had fixed the time for the execution for Friday, February 4th. Both husband and wife were completely overcome by the termination of the trial. They almost had to be carried back to the jail. But great concern was now felt for them spiritually. They were daily visited at the jail by both men and women who earnestly sought to prepare them for eternity. Now, one of these people was the grandmother of the family member who is writing this article. It is through this grandmother that much with reference to the last days of the Fishers, especially Mrs. Fisher, has come down. Well, I tell you what happened. Lavinia acted like a complete horse's rear end. Just wait and see. Mr. Fisher seemed penitent from the first and seemed deeply concerned about his soul, but not so his wife. She was reckless and defiant, again and again upbraiding her husband for his chicken heart. She seemed more concerned about a petition for pardon than anything else. Lavinia Fisher was convinced that she was going to get a pardon from the governor. First of all, she didn't feel like she was guilty, and secondly, she was a woman, and a beautiful woman at that. Well, according to some accounts, the law in South Carolina at the time was that a woman could not be hanged if she was married. Of course, they had an easy solution to that. Unalive Mr. Fisher first, making her a widow. And the Fishers were so upset and out of sorts about it, it was said that they, petitioned the governor to give them a stay because they were just not ready. Well, it was granted. Now, later we find out that there was a big horse race coming up on that date, and that's a huge bunch of revenue for the city. So it is very doubtful that the stay was granted because of their state of mind. Okay? It's all about the money, During their last days, the Fishers were confined in the dungeon of the jail. Ooh. Here the ministers and other good men and women continued to visit them up to the very last hour. One of the most faithful was the Reverend Dr. Furman, pastor of the First Baptist Church. He stood by the miserable pair through everything. Another faithful one was the Reverend Mr. Gallows of the Methodist Church. He was particularly concerned with reference to Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Fisher expressed through repentance for his sins. He admitted that he had led a wicked life, but declared that he was not a criminal. His peace having been made with God, he implored his wife to do the same, but she would not. To not one word of religious instruction would she listen. She expected to live, she declared, and why should she prepare for death? Maybe because you got the death sentence?
Both John and Lavinia chose to go to the gallows wearing white, which they purchased out of their own pockets. It is said that Lavinia chose a wedding-type dress because she was convinced that she would get a proposal on the way. And this is why it is said she was hanged in her wedding dress.
When the hour for the execution arrived and they went to conduct the criminals from their cells, Mrs. Fisher shrieked and raved like one insane and fought with the strength of desperation. It was some time ere they could remove her. Her husband sought to soothe her. He took her in his arms. His agony, it was pitiful to see. He entreated, implored her to be calm and to employ what little time remaining in making preparation for the end. In other words, you better have a conversation with Jesus. And again her frantic shrieks burst forth. Fisher and his wife were clothed in white garments, provided at their own expense. The carriage started from the jail at 12:45. All along the route an immense concourse had gathered, for it was an unusual sight to see a woman led to execution. As Mr. Fisher beheld the gallows on which he was to succumb, he turned deathly white and seemed to faint. His wife, not so much. When they attempted to make her go up, she positively refused. Neither persuasions nor threats could avail. She could not believe she was to be unalived. She had literally to be dragged up the gallows steps. She called upon the multitude to rescue her and stretched forth her trembling arms, imploring pity. At one moment she would rant and blaspheme and stomp and rave with incoherent wildness. And then she would say, "How could you do this to a woman?" Silence like that of death hung over the vast assembly, broken only by the shrieks, truly demonic, of this very maniac on the very verge of eternity. She was totally unprepared to die. It was pitiable and truly heart-rending. Oh, but it gets worse. A minister approached, the Reverend Mr. Gallows. He sought to calm her and attract to her attention, to offer her words of spiritual hope. She stopped and, fixing her blazing eyes on him, said in accents clearly distinguishable by many, "Cease! I will have none of it. But if you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, and I will carry it." The minister drew back, shocked, overcome with horror. Now, with frantic gesticulations, she called upon heaven to have mercy upon her and save her soul. Well, I guess that's the original Hail Mary. But the time was brief. She felt she had delayed too long to make her account with heaven, and now the dreadful messenger of death tugged at her despairing heart. At a little past 2:00, the drop fell. Their bodies were cut down and interred in the potter's field. Afterwards, I have heard that they were disinterred, and that the skeletons now hang in the museum of the Charleston Medical College. Okay, so let me tell you this. Here are some of the things that we don't know for sure. It is said that indeed Lavinia, at least her skeleton, was dug up from the potter's field and put on display. And if you've listened to any of my old podcasts, you know that was something they used to do. Like, carry dead bodies around and charge people money to look at them. Well, apparently people used to spit on Lavinia's skeleton, and after a while they really thought, it was in poor taste, but probably they had made enough money off of her. And so it is said that she was put in an unmarked grave in the Unitarian Cemetery in Charleston. There is no verification that I know of this, so officially she is in Potter's Field. But now some people have seen apparitions at the Unitarian Cemetery, and they say it's Lavinia. Another thing that we don't know, and again this goes back to recent research, it is thought that perhaps John and Lavinia were not really legally married, but in common law. Now, there are some podcasts and there are some books of research that suggest that Lavinia was maybe mixed race. It is said that she was very beautiful and darker skinned. And John's uncle was also a plantation owner. Okay, so there is a good chance that what happened, and this is one speculation, that John fell in love with Lavinia and of course was not allowed in that time period to marry her. And when his uncle found out, he had Lavinia sent to Charleston, at which point John followed her. And because she had taken the last name of Fisher, who was, the family name, and that's what they did because they didn't have last names, that John and Lavinia, both having that name Fisher, were able to get by with that. Now, there are no marriage records, so we don't know for sure. However, it does stand to reason that at least John was very much in love with Lavinia, as he did not leave her in jail, and he really, really wanted her to make things right at the end. Now, there's another aspect to this that talks about the politics and land, and possibly that they were falsely accused, because even though they were found guilty of highway robbery, and that was punishable by death, the 6 Mile House land really wanted to be taken by the city, and they would have to, in order for no heirs or anybody to claim that, it would have to be such a heinous crime and sit there for a year before the city could claim it, it lines up. So is it possible? Of course it is. The corruption didn't start this year. So anyway, it's a very interesting story. There are many people who say when they visit the old city jail in Charleston that they hear things, that they get scratches, that they hear whispers. They say that Lavinia actually haunts that. Now, I don't know, but it does seem to me that when she was being executed, she had such a vehement belief that she was going to be pardoned, and she kept saying she was innocent. I think maybe all of this hostility and anger could be because she was not actually involved. By the way, they were only convicted of robbery, not murder. So there you go. All right, I hope you enjoyed this tale of Lavinia Fisher. And boy, I know it was long, but tell me below, are there any other stories that you want to hear that are vintage and fascinating, like that of the beautiful Lavinia Fisher? All right, I hope you have a great week. I will see you soon. In the meantime, whatever you do, stay safe and stay silky.